Welcome to Laser Radio. I'm Brad Soner. This episode is brought to you by the new Laser Bullet helmet. The perfect combination of aerodynamics and ventilation, the Bullet is designed with a narrow front profile and smooth top section with minimal venting for maximum aerodynamic benefit. The air slide system allows for ventilation on demand with quick and easy adjustment of the front vent cap. Compatible with both the Laser LifeBeam integrated heart rate monitor system and the Laser inclination sensor position monitor, the Bullet is available in both standard and MIPS versions. In stock and available now, visit your local Laser dealer for more information on the Laser Bullet. Yes, that intro music was a little different than our normal intro here on Laser Radio. That was the original score written for the Red Zinger Classic. I'm being joined on the show today by the promoter of the Red Zinger Classic and Coors Classic, the legendary bicycle races out here in Colorado. We are at the home of the one and only Mr. Michael Aisner, who has just shared with me the 45s that were made for the race. I don't know that there's many races that had their own theme song written and performed for the race.
Yeah, we had this guy who was a good friend of mine, and he was a great musician. And he wrote that song that he called Tapioca. And I kept hearing that in my head all the time, and I thought that the race had to have a soundtrack. Everything in life needs to have a soundtrack. And if you have a sporting event, I wanted to have an identifiable, iconic thumbprint that just was there. Every time they heard that, they knew this race was starting or finishing. And even to this day, I keep getting people that were old staff members or maybe marshals, officials that worked the bike race, and they would come to me and say, can I get a copy of that? And I got an MP3 out fire.
And so finally, there was enough demand to print it. You guys were selling records to
Yeah, we were selling
public.
records. We sold everything. We did it. We did $1 million in our second to last year. We did $1 million in the sale of Coors Classic and merchandise, and the final year $1.5 million. That's in 1980s money.
Yeah.
That was pretty extraordinary. And major teams, franchise teams, Denver Broncos, Green Bay Packers, were not doing anywhere near the kinds of numbers that we had done, because that really wasn't a thing then. Merchandise sales wasn't really a revenue generator. For me, it was a critical piece because I could only get so much from a sponsor, and I knew that. So the amount of money that we could get from Celestial Seasonings in the early days or from Coors was capped. And if I wanted to grow the race, I needed to grow the race. I needed to find ways to fund this thing that was going to be our dream that we wanted to see expand and grow, and the way to do it was by coming up with new revenue streams, and one of them was merchandising.
There were a lot of firsts for you guys, the organization, not just first in America, but first for bike races. The way you guys approached the Coors Classic and the Red Zinger races, it wasn't just a bike race. And I think that changed bike racing in America drastically. Now, a lot of things we've sort of lost, things that you guys like merchandise, that the American bike races now just don't really have. We sort of lost that.
I think my philosophy, Brad, always was that I didn't want to make this the greatest bike race in the United States or one of the greatest bike races in the world. My goal was to make it one of the best sporting events in America. So my sights were set on Sports Illustrated, on network television. I wanted this thing to resonate with real people who got excited about it the way I did, right? What was your first bike race experience? Your parents drove you by a bike race, and you looked at it and said, wow, this is extraordinary. It's exactly what I did. I was visiting Mo Siegel, who is the founder and president of Celestial Seasonings, at his office I had just gotten back from doing this project where they were killing the baby harp seals off the coast of Canada, and I was doing that at 22 or 23 years old as a PR guy, helping expose
You were trying to
what was
stop
going
the
on
killing of the baby
trying to
seals.
expose what was going on up there.
Right, all right.
So I brought a lot of world press up there, and Mo heard about it. I came back to Boulder and just went over and had a lunch with him, and he was telling me about this bike race that he had started. This was 1977. He had started it in 75. And he started it for all sorts of altruistic purposes. He wanted to save the world. When he checks into the pearly gates, he wants the old man to be able to go, hey, with his hand on his shoulder, you did great. Look at this. You got people back on bicycles. You got people healthy, and you got cars off the road. Those were Mo's, really his ultimate outcome that he wanted to get from starting this bike race. So he started it because he thought, if I could draw attention to it with professional bike racing, then maybe people will get on their bikes. We'll use this as a platform to talk about cycling and the benefits of cycling. So he started this little 3-day thing in Colorado in 75.
It started it was called the Red Zinger?
It was called the Red Zinger Bicycle Classic. That was the first name of it. And, right out of because he decided that he was going to offer real money and have a men's and women's race run concurrently, that he was going to start to attract the best racers in the country. And the very first year running a stage race in Boulder, Colorado, he had the biggest names in American cycling and even some foreign racers that came over here to compete.
Yeah, talk about impressive for a first-year event. I mean,
right.
Everyone came here.
Yeah.
There was no question that it was the best in the world racing, at the peak of the Coors Classic. How did you communicate with the teams? I mean, did you have to sell them on coming, or was it, if you're a bike racer, you got to be here?
There were a couple of real attractions. One of them was the altitude and that they could come here and train. The other was that this was a very bike-friendly town.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of bike paths. Probably the second most number of miles of bike paths in a town other than Davis, California. So there was that piece of it. So they knew that the public was welcoming. It was also a very athletic-friendly town. Frank Shorter lived here, and there was a lot of energy in and around marathon running in this town. So the ingredients were right. It was just a matter of saying, okay, we're going to have a bike race. And it was also in the middle of the country. And we had mountains, and the racers were thirsting for mountain racing here in the United States. Prior to that, it was just like a bunch of flatland stuff. It was, we had a tour of California back then. We had a bunch of East Coast things, some of the little circuits, 3-4 day races, but they were all flat. And so it was really the kind of thing that criterium racers and circuit racers would really be attracted to. All of a sudden, here's this race in the mountains. And what did we have? Because in 76, we had the Olympic Games, right? And they were up in Montreal. George Mount had done extraordinary up there, right? And it was a tough climb that last lap, or I guess they were on a circuit, so they had to do it a number of times. So we started to really pay attention to mountains and climbing as challenges. And that's what the appeal was here. So we didn't have to beg teams at all to come here. The ones we kind of had to beg when I got involved in this around 1977 were like the Dutch, who were saying, wait a minute, this doesn't work, and it doesn't rain there enough.
The old guard of cycling.
Sure, that's right. But we got them. I mean, they eventually came, and the Dutch were some of the very first teams that we ever got here. The Heineken Amstel teams, and it was awesome having them here because they really gave us a run for our money on the crits.
Yeah,
right?
Those teams, I was going to say the Russians, they became such an integral part of the storyline of so many of those years of racing.
So the Russians came in 79, and that was a throwdown that we did on the steps. It was kind of a ballsy, Aisner shouldn't probably have done it, throwdown on the steps of the Capitol building in Denver with our governor, and Dave Chauner was there, and Peter Coors was. So I was flanked by the governor and Peter Coors with my silly 80s beard, and I challenged the Soviets to come over and to compete at the Coors Bicycle Classic. Yeah. That was probably 1979, and we had the Olympic Games the next year in 1980, and of course they didn't come in 1980. We didn't go to the Olympic Games.
I guess I said the Russians, but it should be the Soviets.
It's
right?
the Soviets.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it was the Soviets.
Yeah.
And for me, it was just one of the most dramatic, one of the biggest gets that we had gotten in the bike race, because it really meant that we were turning the corner. And here's why. We were at that juncture. So for listeners that aren't aware, we were an amateur-only race up until the time it became the Coors Bicycle Classic in 1979. 1980 was the first Coors Classic. When we did that, I then sought to make this a Pro-Am race. I wanted to get the professionals here. I really wanted Le Mans back. And at that point, he was a neo-pro racing for, I think, maybe Peugeot, or if I remember correctly. And so that was part of the goal, was to get Le Mans back here to the race. He actually raced the Red Zinger Bicycle Classic as a junior with special gear dispensation given to him by Eddie Borisevich. And with 1 day to go, Eddie tries to pull him out of the race, and Greg protested because they thought, we're not going to allow him to go into the full stage race. We want him to just race part of it, and we'll pull him at the appropriate time. But we want him to get stage race savviness.
But the fear was that he was going to burn out?
Oh, absolutely. No, it was wrong for his legs, his bones. This was not right. He's a growing boy. This wasn't going to work. And yes, he was racing with all the top guys. And I think, if I remember correctly, even made or would have made the Olympic team in 1980 with Bob Cook and some of the other guys. So he was clearly ready. Yeah. But Eddie was overly protective of Greg, and maybe rightly so. And his dad was here. In fact, there was a point where his dad, Bob LeMond, and Greg LeMond were going to race in the Red Zinger at the same time. Wow. So his dad backed out with like a few days to go, because we had really cranked it up. This had become a serious pro race. Yeah. Back to my original point, and that was that in 1979, when we decided that we wanted to go Pro-Am, I went over and really begged the UCI. I spent time with Hein Verbruggen. I spent time with Phil Liggett, who was a real mentor of mine. Ian Emerson, who was with the British Cycling Federation and eventually became an official here at the Coors Classic after the very untimely death of Artie Greenberg, who just weeks before the bike race, Coors Classic, as our chief ref, was killed back in the East. In a horrible car crash. And I would just want to add to that, with all of the somber that we were going through with the loss of Artie Greenberg, who had come out here, he had gone over the courses with us, with our technical director, worked hard to make sure that this race was done. His job was to turn into us the tech notes that would go into the race Bible, right? That was the official notes. This is how this race is going to be conducted. Artie is killed on, I'll just say, on a Friday. And on Monday morning, I go to the mailbox, and in there are Artie's tech notes, which he dropped off on his way to his death. Wow. Yeah. Pretty insane. So we got Artie's tech notes. We ran the race under that. Ian Emerson came over. Now I'm back in Europe, and I'm trying to get them to agree to let us be a Pro-Am race. And in a way, they kind of didn't care, because we were way over in America.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
No one cared. Yeah. It was all about Europe. It was really French-centric, Belgian-centric, Dutch. That's what it was. Italian. That's what cycling was all about. Here's what I was after. I was after trying to get the best pros in the world to go up against the best amateurs. And in my long-range vision, it was the meeting of the Soviets with someone who had won the Tour de France. Because every single cycling magazine would do these split-screen covers with Sergei Sukharuchenkov on the left side and Bernard Hinault on the right side. And they would have something in French about the great competition that would never happen, because there was no race in the world that we could compete against. Right. We had the great amateur races in the world. The milk race in England was one that I really patterned my race after, and Phil Liggett was the promoter of that. So I would go to the milk race and just watch it and absorb everything I could as it trying to be an understudy to learn. I'm now responsible for this bike race. I bought it from Mo Siegel in 1979 for $1, and I took it down to Peter Coors at the Adolph Coors Company with Moe's blessings, and we donned this thing, the very first major sporting event that the Adolph Coors Company had done. Prior to that, they were doing Belgian horses, which was hardly original at that point because we had the Clydesdales for Budweiser. I mean, give me a break. That wasn't good.
Real original.
Nothing, right? And then they had, balloons. They did balloons, but they didn't even have a sports department.
Yeah.
So we forced them having a sports department. Our budget went from, Moe's budget was probably maybe $180,000 to maybe $350,000. So I kind of maybe almost doubled my budget just by taking it down the road to Coors. And Moe was excited about that. He wanted to see the race go off and grow. And there was one turning point that's a fun story. He was on an airplane going somewhere back east, and he turned to somebody who was sitting next to him and said, "Hi, I'm Mo Siegel. Nice to meet you." They said, "Oh, so what do you do?" And he goes, "Well, I have a tea company back in Colorado that I started." "Oh, no kidding. Yeah, what's the name of it?" And he goes, "Well, it's called Celestial Seasonings, and we have a tea called the Red Zinger." And the guy turns to me and goes, "Red Zinger, why would you name your tea after a bike race?" And he realized that the race had grown larger than the tea company, which was a regional, at best, tea company at that point. And he realized, you know what, this thing really needs to grow. And he, with all his grace, let his baby go to Peter Coors, who then allowed us to be able to grow it. So 79 was my first year as race director, coming off of being PR guy. And off we went to try to make this thing, a big event. And we focused on things like, as a good example, Bicycling Magazine would come to us, or Velo News would come to us, and they would want to be the official magazine of the bike race. Of course they would. Why wouldn't they? But I thought maybe we should divide that category up. Maybe there should be the official magazine, and then there should be the official bike magazine. So I let Velo News and Bicycling kind of split up their respective roles with the race itself. But I trundled off to New York City and sat in Jan Wenner's office at Rolling Stone magazine and made a pitch. And the pitch was, dude, this is a rock and roll sport. They go 65 miles an hour down the backside of mountain passes in rarefied air on tires that had, balloon thin latex on them that cost more than your fancy car tires. Right? And he would just scratch his head, and it was like he didn't know what to say. I'm saying this is a sport that is rock and roll. And we did a pullout section of Rolling Stone magazine that year that had our race maps in there. All of my race sponsors got value added by being in frickin' Rolling Stone magazine. So it was a great campaign for us. But that was to give you a sense of it, the vision that I had for the race. It wasn't about making a great bike race or being better than the Tour de France. It was about making a great sporting event in this country. And when David Michaels, the NBC producer, got assigned to the race, and he brought in this young cub sports reporter out of Indiana named John Tesh, and the two of them married the Coors Classic with that wonderful dramatic stuff that they later took off to the Tour de France and won many awards for NBC and CBS over the years, doing their wonderful work, their storytelling, archival, prime time work.
It was really different than the cycling coverage we see today. Today, our cycling coverage is focused so much on cycling fans, on cycling specific stuff.
Yeah.
And we have these, you can watch an entire race live for 6 hours on TV or streaming or whatever. But you guys were more about the storytelling. You were producing packages. It was, sending it off to CBS or ESPN or whoever wanted it. And you could really build those stories.
Yeah.
But that was a big part of your. I mean, that's your thing. That was right up your alley.
Always, because before the race started, every year I would sit down and I would draw up a list of all of these little juicy feature tidbits that had nothing to do with cycling.
Yeah.
I think some of it had to do with the fact that I didn't have a cycling background. I could now put together a really good bike race, but I wasn't making the bike race for bike racers because I wasn't a bike racer. I was a guy who loved good sports and exciting sports. sports. And when I walked up and saw that first race in 1977 that I had already started doing PR for, and I met someone like Connie Carpenter, this young, redhead, fiery, feisty female racer, I didn't understand the difference between men's and women's cycling. I thought they were in great parity. I had no sense that this was a men's race and oh, by the way, a women's race. And you know what proved it to me was Connie and Jane Biney and Mary Jane Rioch and the great racers who came here to compete. They were neck and neck the whole way. There was no sitting up, doing, just piano, just hanging out in the pack stuff. They were hardcore bike racers. And you'd get them off the bike, and they were at each other's throat. Frickin' love that stuff. Right? So then I brought Jeannie Longo over as a nemesis to Connie Carpenter. Fireworks. Dude, this was the best stuff ever because they were yelling at each other. They were, Jeannie with her, but Connie Carpenter, she cannot win this. This is my race,
An American.
Yeah.
How can an American beat me?
Oh, my God, right? Yeah. So, and then on the men's side, I just kept bringing over foreigners, right? So the Mexicans came over next, and I think probably the biggest coup for us were the Colombians. The very first stage race that the Colombians competed at as a nation outside, in modern times, outside of Colombia, was the Coors Bicycle Classic.
Really?
They came up here with Patrocinio Jimenez and Luis Herrera. All these guys went on to the Tour de France after us. Out of Mexico, we had this young guy named Raul Alcala, had never been in a stage race in the United States before, who had his eye on Alcala, but Jim Akowitz, and he eventually brought him over onto his team. There was a young kid that was out of the Dakotas, who was brought here by Michael Fatka as a junior, and he was catching racers at the top of the wall in the Morgul Bismarck. It was Andy Hampsten, because he wanted Andy to feel a stage race. He wanted him to live through it. Yeah. He wanted to be in dorms. He wanted to see what it was like to wake up in the morning and to do that whole thing. So that's how Andy got involved in the whole thing. The first stage race that the Australians had ever been in was here at the Coors Classic. Who came up? Phil Anderson goes on to take the white jersey at the Tour de France, and years of great yellow jersey stuff and more at the Tour, top 10, top 5s at the Tour de France. So this race was really responsible for a lot of those guys' emergence into the real world.
The road to the Tour de France went through the Coors Classic. For an American rider, I think just about everyone raced here at some point.
That's right. And then came the indelible handshake, the relationship between Oach and Sean Petty and the Southland Corporation and the Coors Classic. They needed us badly because we were providing network television that justified, their expenditure for the team all year long. Because after us, it was the milk race. Yeah. There just was not a lot in America at that point, or I guess now. Yeah. And so that was an important piece, was the fact that we meant something to sponsors, and that sponsors literally got to teams to get into the Coors. Yeah. And, it was an invitational, so not many of them actually got in. We now start to reach 1980, and I throw down the gauntlet on the steps. Soviets, get over here. And the way we had to communicate with the Soviets was by telex. Yeah. So we would go down to the brewery and in Golden and fire up a telex that invited them to come over. I had to spell everything out. We're going to pay all the airfares, Moscow, Denver, Moscow. We're going to provide FBI security for them while they're here, because it was in the heart of the Cold War. We're talking about the 80s.
Was there any,
right?
Did you have any government questions? Did an FBI agent ever show up at your door?
Absolutely.
What are you doing talking to the...
Yeah, it's a great story. After the Soviets accepted, then Secretary beeps in one day, and she said that there's a commander so-and-so from the FBI on the phone, and I took the call, and he said, I'd like to come up and spend a few minutes with you to understand that the Soviets are coming over to compete. And I said, sure. So that was FBI day at the office, and everybody dressed up. And he came in and sat down, closed my door, and he said, look, they may try to defect. And I want to walk you through what's going to happen if indeed they do it. Tell us about your race. What kind of security is here? What would we need to do to keep our eye on these guys? If they try to defect, here's what the procedure was. Yeah. And they weren't opposed to them defecting at all, but they wanted to make sure that it was done through diplomatic channels.
They knew where they were, they knew.
That's right. All of that was legitimate. So we ran two scenarios. One is the coach comes to us and says, the entire team wants to defect. We're here. Take us all. Yeah. We're never going home again. And the other is an individual racer who would corner us and do it. By the way, at the same time, we also had the East Germans here. So with the East Germans and the Soviets, we had Eastern Bloc. That was really delicious for me. Oh, my God. Are you kidding me? Hey, Denver Post, UPI, Reuters, Agence France Presse, all European press. By the way, the Soviets and the East Germans are coming to the United States for the first time to compete. And indeed they did. We had in North Boulder Park, someone got out there in the middle of the night and in Cyrillic wrote to the left with an arrow pointing left, freedom, and to the right it said bike race in Cyrillic. And we had our marshals out there scrubbing it down early in the morning after, by the way, Aisner tips the press off to go down there and do a whole bunch of stories of doing stand-ups right there at this thing, and then having us, try to scrape down
as soon as they're off air, you start...
No, while they're on air, we're starting to scrape. Excuse me, they're saying as they're trying, we have to get this off here. And as the camera zooms back, and now the stand-up guy is relishing in this exclusive that he's got standing there. So that was really it. We really oriented this race towards the media. The race in Denver that we finished at the Tivoli in Denver was finished at 5 o'clock at 5:22. When do they go on with live sports? 5:20 every night, all 3 Denver TV stations. And could they feed the networks? Yeah. So they would start the show at the top of the hour. They would open the newscast at the bike race. Mm-hmm. The sports guy would do a stand-up saying, we'll be back here at about 10 after for a package. And then at 10:22, they'll be there for the live finish of the race. And you know how they do it for criteriums. They give you numbers of laps. They do it as a timed race, and then they boil it down to numbers of laps calculated by the officials so that they know that this race will end exactly at 5:22. And our officials were so fun. They loved playing with this bike race. They would come to me, march up, looking at their watch at the end, and they would look at 5:22, missed it by 4 seconds. Yeah. Are you okay with that? And I'd go, Ian, man, you're the best, or Beth Estes. Yep. You guys are awesome because you just get it done. And that was it. So we had a lot of fun. We had all 3 Denver TV stations travel with us the entire 16 days of the bike race, even to Hawaii when we started the race over there. And media was a critical piece to everything that we do. I have a book that's downstairs that's about 4 inches thick. And all it is a combination of headlines from newspapers all over the world, mostly in the United States, that had the word Coors in the headline. Oh, cool. And that's what I would walk into the brewery with at the end of the year, and I would do the thunk check, which was just dropping this on their desk and sitting my ass down in front of them and saying, that's it, boys. Renew. Right, that's it. And we did for 9 years.
Tell me about taking the race to Hawaii. How did that come about? It had been done before with the Grand Tours, right, where they're doing these destination starts. But why Hawaii? How Hawaii? How did that come about?
Eisner got bored.
You just like Hawaii? You're just like...
No, that was it. I had gone actually there in the early Red Zinger years, probably 1979. Phinney and myself and Mary Jane Rioch and other winners of the Coors Classic. Well, let me back up. Celestial Seasonings came out with this fruit beverage. It was a cold fruit beverage that was delicious. It wasn't tea, called Haiku. And I thought, wait a minute, to promote Haiku at the Red Zinger Bicycle Classic, why don't we give away to the Michelob Tour of Hawaii, which is a little weird. So I contacted the promoter over there, Carlos Rivas, and I said, Carlos, can I give away 2 trips, the winners of the Coors Classic? or Redzinger at the time, get to go into your race? And he said, sure, why would I not do that? Are you kidding me? The biggest race in America? So we sent the two winners over there. Phinney was the highest finishing American at that point, and Connie Carpenter didn't want to go, so Mary Jane Riak went. So we all went to Hawaii, and that's where I fell in love with Hawaii and the bike racing environment that was over there. That's where we met Jeff Roque for the first time, who was a crank doing mechanic work for just a bike store there. Jeff went on to become one of the great American bike race announcers over the years, who I worked with many, many times. I worked with him 20 years in Philadelphia. So that was Hawaii. We fell in love with Hawaii. So each island has a mayor.
Okay.
So it isn't just the mayor of Hilo or the mayor of Kona. It was the mayor of the big island of Hawaii. So I contacted this guy, Dante Carpenter, big, wonderful guy, and I said, I'd like to bring the bike race over. Will you help pay for it? It's going to be very expensive to do this. We need to house them. We need to feed them. And I need, to figure out a way to get them over here. So I convinced Continental Airlines to fly the entire race entourage over there.
Cool.
I had to replicate the Coors Classic look on the big island, which was, thousands of miles away. So we were stuffing things into the plane that were part of the look, the image. We'd roll up the banner, and it was the same banner that we would use back on the mainland. And we started the race on Oahu and then took it over to the big island. And we did 3 or 4 stages in Hawaii, then went back to San Francisco. We did Fisherman's Wharf, then up to Sonoma, Sacramento, Reno, Grand Junction, Aspen, Estes Park, Denver, Boulder. And that was the Coors Classic. So 16 stages, and Hawaii was pretty awesome place.
There's a lot of legendary courses that that were born over the years of the Coors Classic. Do you have one that stands out for you? Is there the Morgul Bismarck, I think, is probably one that, I've heard the lore of from anyone who was racing in the 80s.
Yeah.
Is there one that stands out as your baby, or one that sticks in your mind?
I'm going to have to say probably, I'm going to give you a couple, but in terms of a circuit race, so I'll break them out into circuit races, criteriums, and road races, because that's what the beauty of the Coors Classic was this wonderful omnium of these events that produced this overall winner to the race. Can't do that anymore, right? Because the little short circuit criteriums are disallowed in major UCI races. Yeah. But back then, we fully took advantage of that. So my favorite circuit race certainly was the Morgul Bismarck. We had done it every single year of the bike race. 13-mile circuit, cuddled between Denver and Boulder, out in the middle of at the time, nowhere. Yeah. It was Cowsville, and just outside the outskirts of Boulder. So everyone from Denver could come. Everyone from Boulder could come. So it was just tens of thousands of people, and the race finished on this 20% or something grade thing we called the wall. And the spectators had their own wall to sit on, which was this just huge kind of mound of mountain on either side of the wall. On one side of the wall, the other side was kind of looking out back to the Rockies. It was picturesque. Yeah. You could look down. We'd put cherry pickers at the top, and the camera shot had them dipping down and losing sight. The men would do 7 laps. The women would do 4 laps. They'd both be on the course at exactly the same time, well-timed. So we saw a bike race every 20 minutes coming through the finish line. It was glorious. And some of the greatest racers and moments in sport happened there. When Eddie Merckx, who came here as our guest one year, rode up that thing, he just said, this is a world championship course. There's no reason you shouldn't use it for the Worlds. And when we got the Worlds here in Colorado, there was this thing about not using anything that was Coors Classic. The Federation just had their arms folded. They wanted to use the Air Force Academy. Sadly, we ended up going down there. It was bitter cold, and there were 15 people watching a world championships of cycling. It was just sad. So, yeah, Morgul Bismarck was certainly one of them. And we also shot the movie Hell of the West, which is a Kevin Costner film directed by John Badham. And that was shot right there. We replicated the Coors Classic, but in a different form. We called it the Hell of the West. And we ran that out there, and the wicked descents on the far side. It's a great film. If you haven't seen the film, American Flyers. I don't want to say it's a great film, but it's a great view for anybody that's really excited about cycling. You should absolutely watch that film. And much of it, by the way, the long shots were all shot at the Coors. So any of the helicopter things or the far long shots that
there's a lot of people in the cycling world now who were in the movie because the announcers and the officials, because that was all real life. I mean, they shot that at the race.
Yeah, Brian Drebber up there calling the races. He always did every year for us. Great voice. So the Morgul Bismarck circuit race, in terms of mountain races, it's all over the map, but I got to say the Capitol building in Denver to the top of Vail Pass is just an insane, ridiculous race that was won, of course, by a Colombian. Going down the backside of Floyd Hill here in Colorado, which is this screaming descent where they have now truck ramps because every truck that goes up there loses their brakes. The thing is so steep and so long. Were the Soviets up against the Colombians, and the Colombians, by the time they got to Floyd Hill, had a 5-minute lead, and by the bottom, because they didn't know how to descend very well, and the Soviets did all sorts of wind tunnel training on how to lean way over their handlebars with their knees locked together and literally their face down, their nose down over the front wheel, which the Colombians would never do. They gained the 5 minutes back and put another 5 minutes on them, just descending with no cranking at all. So then there was the race to the top of Vail Pass. So that was a glorious one. And then criteriums, it's North Boulder Park.
Yeah.
I mean, it's North Boulder Park. We had the race change in the last day of the race. We had a Colombian out in front, and Jacques Boyer laps the park 3 times to take over the lead and become the winner on the road, and then eventually crossing the line that day. So we've had some wonderful, great races and racers over the years that just were so memorable. I'm having a tough time pulling out my favorites, but for you, I found those 3.
We're going to talk about a lot more. We got to wrap this episode up. This is going to be a 2-part series with Michael. So this will wrap up episode 1 here. Michael, thanks for joining us, and stay tuned to Laser Radio. We got the second half of this interview coming up. This has been another episode of Laser Radio. Be sure to check out more great shows on the Wide Angle Podium Network. Until next time, I'm Brad Soner, saying thanks for listening.